So let's talk power scaling in the One Piece verse a little. We'll be going over what tiers naturally exist in there and how strong those tiers actually come out to be. If you have spent much time in or around the One Piece verse at all, I'm sure you will have heard terms like Yonko level, Yonko commander, admiral. These are the well-established tiers of strength that Oda has meticulously gone through and set out, but there's a few more, some debatable and some a little more hard set in stone. Let's take a look at them and what powers each of them possess. Our first tier, that's basically the peak of the verse, is the Pirate King tier. This would be people like Roger and people that would scale to him. This is also, I'm sure, where Luffy will end up at the end. I didn't really think this was a tier back in the day, just thinking that the Pirate King was just high Yonko, but then something happened.
絶えない凶暴な一味だったメンバーは船長ロックスを筆頭に若き日の白ひげビッグマムカイドウかつて新世界の覇権を争うほどの存在だった金獅子の指揮他にも銀部キャプテンジョン王女名の事件は38年前ゴッドバレーで起きた誰も止めることができなかった悪の進撃を海軍中将ガープという男がこの戦いで海賊と手を組んでしまったここに居合わせたガープとロジャーが手を組みロックス海賊団を打ち破った事件
The introduction of the Rocks pirates, Rocks himself, and the God Valley incident was so epic and crazy that it made me rethink the whole structure of the power in the One Piece world. This is when I finally decided that there should be a Pirate King tier. Since we know so little about the tier and I have only like 2-3 examples of who could be in it and only a couple fights with those individuals, can't really say exactly what their power output and speed will be, but based on the tiers below them we can say they're above country and faster than light. I think it's possible that they could be to continental or multi-continental based on what ends up happening with Luffy and the Red Wall. After this is personally my most controversial take, I think, and that would be the Fleet Admiral tier. I'm not 100% as if this group even exists, but if it does, it would be basically because we find out Akainu is stronger than the Yonko. Basically, if Luffy has a big epic end game fight against him. You could also see probably Prime Son Goku and Garp in this tier as well. Since it's a highly theoretical tier, it's hard to say exactly what strengths they have, but they'll be above the Admiral and Yonko tier as we will continue to discuss where they stand. And now we move on to the current top tier of the verse, the Yonko themselves. You don't physically have to have the title of Yonko to occupy this tier, but most of the people in it are of the Yonko status. For example, someone like Mihawk should scale to these individuals without having the title himself. As for their power, we can consistently see the feats of them splitting the sky, which come out to be country level, and feats of like Kaido lifting up and hauling off an island passively support this too. And being that they should be roughly above the admirals in most stats, they should be the speed of light or a little faster. Now to the admirals themselves, they've been pretty useful for scaling. Like the Yonko showed us a good point of reference for power, they show us the best point of reference in the verse for speed. Kizaru, one of the first original admirals we see, is a light human, meaning he should be a good baseline for light speed in his attacks and movement. You can argue that the verse has other light speed feats like the PX and even Foxy, but those aren't consistent at all, as either that would mean that those guys are equal in speed to Kizaru, which the scaling doesn't support, so their light just must be slower than his light. After all, the PX are based on his lasers, but they're clearly a much weaker version, so why can't they just be slower as well? As for power, they're pretty close to the Yonko, but if you don't want to say they're country level 2, they're probably closer to large island level then. Now that we have all the big measuring sticks out of the way, we can get to one of my favorite groups, the Yonko Commander tier. Basically, every single Yonko has 3 main subordinates, although not just those people are in the Yonko commander tier. As for Whitebeard, he had a bunch, and some of them showed off some pretty impressive feats. And Big Mom, who has a 4th commander, Snack, who was relieved of his position, and her son, Perospero, who scales to Jack. So every Yonko crew doesn't have to have just 3 commanders, and that's it. You'll hear tons of people talking about 1st commander, 2nd commander, 3rd commander, and try to give them a hierarchy like that. I prefer just to go by kind of just going with high and low. It's difficult to be accurate when breaking down a tier into sub-tiers. Although, having looked into things, I can make a decent argument for which characters are 1st, 2nd, and 3rd division and make the hierarchy still make sense. So first with Whitebeard's crew, most people say Marco 1, Jozu 2, Vista 3, but a lot of people forget Ace is a well-established member of the crew, so if you put Marco 1, Ace 2, Jozu 3, and Vista 3, it fits a lot better. Then to Big Mom, we have obviously Katakuri at 1st, and a lot of people think Smoothie 2nd, Cracker 3rd, just going off of their bounties. But if we say that Cracker is 2nd as well, then that leaves room for Snack to be 3rd, and since Perospero scales to Jack, who's definitely a 3rd, then that will work as well. Just so this way we don't end up as a 4th commander tier, which is kind of inconsistent, and I think only exists because of the Whitebeard and Big Mom Pirates setup. As for power and speed, they're not quite on the level of Kizaru, so they're approaching light speed, making them relativistic, and power, we can see low members of the tier able to cut mountains in half pretty consistently, which might leave room for the higher tiers to be up to island level. Now we have those who aren't quite Yonko commanders. They're not exactly fodder either. This is what I call the sub-commander, and I think some people use the term 4th commander to describe. Probably the best example of a group like this would be the Topi Ropo, but you can also see it in the Big Mom Pirates with Oven and Daifuku. They just kind of drop down a little from the strength of a commander, so you're probably getting into like maybe city levels of strength and sub-relativistic in speed. Some might say that the Vice Admiral should be a tier above this, or that they are just as strong, but with how little we've seen of them exactly, it's really inconsistent, and I think they fit better at a different tier that I'll describe later. And now we begin to get into the tiers that aren't as commonly known, mostly because I just kind of came up with them myself to explain some of the pre-time skip scaling. These are a pretty common group of individuals that would take the whole Straw Hat crew to defeat back then. We have people like Ors, the Pacifista, and Moria residing here. Based on my averaging of the strength of the Vice Admirals that I'll make a video on eventually, you could probably call this the Vice Admiral tier, but it's not exact. Even though the name isn't really accurate, I kind of like to just call this tier the Giant tier, because the people in it are all very huge, but actually giants tend to fall a little bit lower. As for strength, we've seen people like Moria split an island in half, so that clocks in for these guys around town level, which I think fits. And speed, they're just falling farther and farther away from that light speed, where I think by now they're probably either massively hypersonic or just hypersonic. Now a tier that's a little more well established, this is the Supernova or Rookie tier. Basically people who are over the strength of the Paradise side of the Grand Line and are ready to move on to the New World. All of the people who had 100 million berry bounty or more that reached that ability about the same time, they're all rivals to each other, and you can form a tier with these kind of people, and people we see later like Cavendish and Bartolomeo. They're a few times weaker than the Giant tier in strength and probably a bit slower, but we can see by their feats they're still pretty strong and pretty fast, and just hard to pin down exactly since we only have Luffy to go off of, who's pretty high tier at this time. And now we get into the tiers are basically just the strength of a location. We start with the Paradise tier, where we see people that are entered the first half of the Grand Line but aren't strong enough to move on to the second half yet. If we look at Luffy from like Alabasta, we can see that he's about city block level. And then we just move on to the 4 blues. We know roughly that the North Blue should be the strongest, and it's well established that the East is the weakest. These are just low-level pirates or people that kind of live normal lives that aren't ready to go into the dangers of the Grand Line from feats in this tier. Even though Luffy was far above everyone around him at this point, you can see them knocking down walls and people like Kuro still moving faster than the eye can see, and Luffy intercepting bullets, so they should still be roughly equal to or under the speed of sound given the technology of the time. And that's all the tiers of One Piece and how they scale. I hope you guys enjoyed this and that some of my more headcanon-y bits to explain some of this stuff aren't annoying to all of you. As we go through the manga, more and more we'll learn more and help place individuals and round out the structure of the world's power system. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you later.